rectify the yellow flags there on the last corner. I think I had Rich Northridge and Sam Eminson with a fair bit of momentum in the slipstream behind, but luckily for me, they had to back out of it. I'll just put up this clip from the live stream just to show why we had that final corner yellow flag. A bit of a dramatic incident in the 270 race on their final corner. Thankfully, everybody was okay. A little bit of car damage, a lot of car damage, unfortunately, for a few people. So never good to see. But glad nobody was hurt in that one. The Ollie Smith crosses the line to complete a clean sweep at Spa. So huge congratulations to him. Matt Fox made it into P2. And it's great to see Ben Oliver back on the podium. I don't think he's been on there since our very first race at Brands. So, congratulations, Ben. Great to see you up there. I would much rather it be me, but I would hand over to Garage Kyle to debrief on the race and that spin.
Hello, welcome back to the garage for the final race debrief of the Spa weekend. Let's start. I suppose let's start from the start. The first lap or two. I was over the moon with that, to be honest. I felt like I was just the right sort of punchy to make the most of the slipstream, and made up the places I needed to make up and get myself in that podium fight pretty quickly. Middle part of the race was also feeling pretty good, but as you saw, kind of yo-yoing from P2 to P6 or whatever it was, quite regularly with the slipstream. And there was a bit of contact with Matt once again. I don't think it was anything really. It was there were three of us. Rich was in there as well, 3 wide going into Lake Coombe, and just all squeeze each other a little bit. And I was just in the middle. So it's one of those things, and that's kind of exactly what I talked about on the intro video for Spa, and why I wasn't too keen on the idea of the sort of heavy duty slipstream racing. It just generates situations like that. And then, as the race was starting to wind up, I had one eye on the clock, and I was starting to plan where I wanted to be on which lap and how I was going to try and convert that into a podium position. The win felt out of reach. Ollie just scarpered, and he just managed to maintain a really healthy gap to us, but certainly P2 or P3 was there for the taking. It all came down to that spin at the bus stop. It's my first one. I think it's my first spin in a race. Kind of bad timing, really. Very annoying, but it didn't, in a weird way, it didn't take the shine off the rest of the race. I really did enjoy that race from start to finish, and even the spin itself, it put me in a position where I had one last frantic lap with Rich and Sam, which was a really good laugh. It's annoying, and that cost me ultimately a podium, but it's one of those things, and luckily everybody around me took avoiding action, and there was no further damage. And so to sort of analyse that spin, it was basically that I locked the rear axle as I was coming down through the gears, and this is why we heel and toe in these cars, because you're trying to maximise that engine braking, and if you just wang it down a gear without matching the revs, it just locks up the rear axle, and that's exactly what happened. So to kind of look into why that happened, my initial thought, and you might have picked up on it, I actually did exactly the same thing again, just didn't spin. One corner later, so after the spin recovery, I went into the La Source hairpin, and exactly the same happened. And going back through the Vbox data, I just wasn't catching the throttle, or I wasn't catching it enough with my foot, which is very unusual because I've been driving this car now for 2 years almost. And I've never had problems like these before. So my initial thought, and you may have noticed in the video, is I put the brake bias forward for that final lap. I thought, I'd not even twigged in the cockpit that it was a heel-toe issue. I thought it was something was going on with the brakes, and I was locking the rear under braking. Obviously that wasn't the case. I can see that now, but in the heat of the moment, that's what I tried. And then my initial theory after after coming home and seeing the data, was that the brake pedal must have moved, which isn't that crazy to say, because I have been having problems on and off with this car, whereas my brake pads get worn and I use a bit of the brake pad, my brake pedal starts getting longer and longer. So maybe that my foot was just pushed out of a comfort zone where I could catch the accelerator, and I kind of got a bit drastic with this. And for some reason, just out of desperation, really, I decided to rebuild my brake master cylinder after I got back, which I was going to video, but there was brake fluid everywhere, and so picking up phones and cameras wasn't really ideal. So I gave that one a miss. But yeah, so I rebuilt the master cylinder. And it was actually only when I was starting to put the car back together, put the master cylinder back on, and I was putting the pedal box back together, and I noticed this is the throttle cable coming in, and there's a little adjuster nut on here. So this adjustment nut pushes the throttle cable in and out, which helps you take up the slack in the throttle pedal. And this nut was backed all the way in this direction, and this whole mechanism was loose. It was just flopping around in this sort of void. So I'm just wondering if that had created a little bit of slack to the throttle pedal, which meant as my foot was catching it in that initial, 5-10% of its travel, it wasn't really applying the revs. You wouldn't notice it at full throttle because your foot's all the way to the floor anyway, so it's going to take up that slack. And it's a long shot, but I've tightened it up, and we'll see how I get on. I've got some track time coming up for the next race weekend, so we'll see how reliable my throttle blips are. But actually, through the process of editing these videos, I was noticing that my throttle blips were getting weaker and weaker from qualifying onwards, really. The amount of revs I was giving it each time was getting less and less. So yeah, it's definitely one to keep an eye on, and that's something I need to learn. I need to be analysing this sort of stuff during a race weekend and try to pick up on these patterns rather than wait until after the race weekend. So yeah, that was so there's all my racing driver excuses for the spin. It was ultimately a failed heel toe, whatever the reason was, whether it was driver error, it was driver error, but whether there was an underlying mechanical issue or not, it's irrelevant. I need to be more wary of these things in the future. Other dramas in the race, obviously we had the coming together with Rich and Mitch, which is unfortunate. Front runners coming together is never, any drivers coming together is not nice, but in the heat of battle, those guys clashed, which isn't ideal, and that kind of helped me out really in the end. It minimised the damage of how many places I lost ultimately due to that spin. But yeah, that was about it for my race. I was on balance. I was really happy with the race. The mistake aside, the mistake was a shame. But I'm not going to let that detract from the rest of it. I thought the racing was good fun, and I enjoyed racing with everybody during that event.